Okay, it's 2 minutes after 1. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to MHPN's March webinar, Enduring by Design, Historic Facade Material Performance and Preservation in Practice. My name is Xiaohan Smith. I am your session moderator. Before I turn it over to our speaker, I would like to go over some Zoom items. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box as you think of them. All the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please also type them into the Q&A box. And the chat box will be used to share links and resources discussed during the webinar. Both the chat box and Q&A box are located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you don't see them, please wiggle your mouse and they should pop up. If this is your first time attending our webinar, we are the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. We support the sustainability and economic viability of Michigan's historic places through advocacy, education, and direct action. We could not do the work we do without our members and volunteers. If you are not a member yet, please consider joining us at www.mhpn.org. And we have an announcement that our 2026 annual statewide conference, Resilient by Design, is happening in May 7th through 9th. And the registration is open and registration deadline is April 22nd. I will send the link to the conference in the chat in a bit. If you are seeking AICP continuing education credits, you will need to submit your credits online after this activity. And if you are seeking AIA credits, you will need to send me your name and AIA number by email. I will get both of those information into the chat box in a little bit here. And our webinars are supported in part by an award from the Michigan Arts and Culture Council and the National Endowment for the Arts. We want to say a big thank you to our sponsors. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce you our speaker, Sarah Holcomb. And Sarah is a director of historic preservation with Walker Consultants NYC office. Sarah's bio can be found on our website, and I will also send the link to the chat. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our speaker.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me get my presentation up. So once again, thank you so much to the Michigan Historic Preservation Network for having me. I'm excited to share this presentation with you all. If you do have any trouble hearing me, please let them know and we'll try to resolve that as expediently as possible. I put together this presentation to sort of combine as an overview of a few topics. So really, let me just dive in. We wanted to present an overview of the Secretary of the Interior preservation briefs that many of you likely are and are aware of and use in day-to-day practice on your buildings. Discuss those example materials that exist in historic and landmark buildings, as well as how, time, environment, weather, many things, including deferred maintenance and other work over time affects these materials on these historic structures. And then we will talk a little bit about specific case studies on projects across the country. So I have quite a few slides here. I will try to get through them in efficiently a manner as possible. But if you do have any questions, again, we will have a Q&A session. So please feel free to refer back to a slide if I don't give it as much attention as you'd like in the moment. So historic preservation, today we're going to be talking about how we balance architectural heritage, structural integrity, and of course, material performance of these really fascinating materials that I've worked with for the past 18 years of my career on historic buildings. Typically, when we're looking at even assessing a building, condition assessments of historic buildings, we're often talking with ownership and client teams on what the treatment approach is, whether it is as simple as monitoring. Are we even going to, take an approach that results in a project? Or are we assessing and planning for one of the projects that might encapsulate one of the four concepts on the top of this slide? Preservation typically is pursued when we can stabilize, maintain, or repair an existing structure and its facade and its enclosure. Rehabilitation often adapts a property and may change the use, may explore different alterations to that historic property, but it typically will retain key features, the character of that historic building. Restoration means, in historic context, again, potentially adding on or reconstructing missing elements. And then, of course, reconstruction by definition, perhaps you're recreating a completely non-surviving, a missing structure and putting it back in its original form and location. So for the purposes of this presentation, we are going to be focusing on preservation specifically of existing materials. Um, as the National Park Service website espouses, and as many longtime preservationists will tell you, we believe that in restoring historic buildings is inherently a sustainable practice, right? If we can make the best of these beautiful structures that we have, it is a green and sustainable practice. It's great to see these structures get their life extended for foreseeably another 50 to 100 years or more. Um, and then again, the purpose of this presentation is really to give an overview of some of those very recognizable, iconic materials that are seen often in these types of buildings. Most buildings have, I would suggest, 3 to 5 or more of each different type of material. And, again, a full disclaimer, as I get through this list, the list of preservation briefs that I'll be highlighting for this presentation, you'll notice that each specific preservation brief, each material could likely be covered in its own presentation, in its own discussion on how detailed, how thoughtful we should be in considering the materials highlighted in each one. I believe the briefs vary from about 16 pages to 30 or more pages. There is a lot of content to get through. So what I've done here for the purposes of this presentation is to really highlight the themes that recur in these types of materials that we run into on historic projects. So let's start with cleaning. Cleaning and water repellent, they're not coatings necessarily, but water repellent treatments for historic masonry buildings. And I think many of you will sympathize with why, of course, I highlighted and bolded several phrases on this slide here. As consultants, when we're assessing these historic structures, we can often tell almost immediately that potentially inappropriate or incompatible materials were used right off the bat. We might see deterioration, missing components, failed, spalled, cracked materials. So these are often caused by previously selected materials that were not compatible with those historic materials, whether it's terracotta, brick, mortar. Again, the list goes on. So when considering how to clean historic buildings, we start at the beginning. We start with what was done before, what resulted in that deterioration, what are the contributing factors, how long has water and moisture been infiltrating the facade, and then what are these options for cleaning historic facades? So there are many different options available today to clean historic masonry. Abrasives are not recommended. You'll see that here. But again, it all starts with a mock-up. Um, Typically, we would recommend multiple mock-ups on different elevations, multiple mock-ups on different types of materials. Understanding what actually is clean versus over clean is a very tricky subject, and it really depends on the experience level of the crews, the type of products or not products. You see here steam. I mean, that is one of the most basic ways that many historic buildings have been cleaned is actually just through use of very hot water or steam cleaning apparatuses. So the equipment, cleaning methods, time, all of these things, the experience level of those performing the cleaning and those assessing its effectiveness. It's very important to basically have a written procedure before you go out to the site and understand all of the different factors that can impact the final result. And as I state here, the water repellents. They're not necessarily wrong, but they are a last resort. There are better products available on the market today that are suitable for historic buildings if and when they are deemed appropriate through, many rounds of discussions, right? What is the intent? Typically, if there's unrestrained water infiltration, that's when a water repellent is considered. Very often, in historic structures, the root cause of the problem is simply is simply finding those pathways to water. If you can repoint, which is on the next slide, if you can repoint and address and create a solid wall condition, a water repellent is often not necessary. So it really depends on your building and what you're trying to do for your historic structure. As I mentioned, repointing is a very critical thing for keeping water out of historic masonry walls. Mortar joints were and are intended to be sacrificial. The idea would be for the mortar to crack before the brick, before the stone, before the terracotta cracks, and the continued proper maintenance, proper mortar selection throughout the life of the structure is how you prevent widespread water infiltration and other related issues such as corrosion of the embedded steel. So again, not going to spend too much time on this particular slide. Obviously, mortar is inherently included in all masonry assemblies, or I should say all, but most masonry assemblies. But, petrographic analysis of the mortars, choosing appropriate mortar materials and qualified masons to perform this work is essential. I list here the two types of testing I complete most often on my historic projects with brick masonry and stone masonry, but there are others, and many qualified petrographers can point you in the direction of tests that you may require to understand the proportions of your mortar and things of that type. So again, very important to think of this before you even begin the work on a project. These are a few examples here that can kind of tell us what was going on a facade. These are actually prior to the work moving forward on this particular project. You can sort of see deterioration, cracking in the mortar, step cracks resulting from corroded lintels here on the top, and on the right, a spalled face of brick. Very often we can start to tell that perhaps a poor mortar mix or an inappropriate mortar type was selected in previous repair campaigns. So these are things to look out for as you first step foot on the building. And then, of course, one of the things you do find as you look through these very detailed preservation briefs are those best practices for getting the work started. The preservation brief for repointing specifically states that removal of mortar should be performed by hand, essentially until the crew can prove they are able to remove the mortar without damaging the adjacent brick. And as you can see from the photos on the top, that was a bit unsuccessful in our first few mock-ups. So yeah, again, cannot stress enough the importance of mock-ups for your masonry projects, even when they are something as seemingly simple as repointing, right? So the quantity of repointing, the experience level of the crews can really be critical when you're deciding how to do this, how to, complete a project on a larger scale, a much larger scale. Just touching on roofs really briefly, you know, many historic buildings have very unique historic roofs. So a lot of roof projects will require very specific documentation, sometimes some creativity and understanding how to assess these materials. A lot of times, many different materials coming together in quite a complex manner. So again, I would just suggest, qualified roofing contractors performing probes, again, are very essential. And, durability, water management, these are all things that we consider for modern roofing projects. But with a historic roofing project, the complexity becomes a little bit more compounded. And then a material I'll postpone for later in this presentation when I talk a bit more in detail about some of the historic project case studies is terracotta, what some consider the original material substitute for many structures has, of course, now become synonymous with historic structures. Landmarked buildings often included terracotta as a more cost-effective alternative to natural stone. So we'll get a little bit more into those historic facades, excuse me, later. Repair of historic wood windows. Again, the refrain here is, replacement is a last resort. Many projects do often result in removal of the windows and shop repairs to wood windows, often because obviously it's easier to control the environment where you are restoring these very unique characteristics of buildings. And just kind of a comment here that, we can consider thermal efficiency while still, maintaining the historic aesthetic of the building. Historic wood windows do have better insulating value than metal, but there are plenty of options these days and very qualified craftsmen who are familiar with how to restore wood windows. So it really is considering a holistic approach to the building rather than just defaulting to replacement. But again, the historic preservation briefs just encourage you to consider, the value of what you're able to retain when it's possible. Preservation of historic concrete. Concrete can be kind of a tricky one. Of course, many repairs to concrete are extremely obvious when you repair that in situ. Considering replacement as a last resort, again, trials, mock-ups, evaluating the finish, things as simple as what color is the concrete going to be or its repair material when it cures. It's very, very tricky to match that and determine what you're going to see for the final appearance here. So a mock-up is a non-negotiable in a historic concrete project. And then use of substitute materials on historic buildings. This is a bit of a contentious one. Obviously, I mentioned terracotta, cast stone, cast iron. These were actually considered, substitute materials in their day, and now we're faced with more options to select from, and often these options can be an alternative, especially when there is a reason, structural feasibility, durability, other considerations. When we're trying to achieve code required performance, analyzing something for wind loads, snow loads, design loads in certain very harsh environments like the Northeast can be pretty complex. And so oftentimes we are balancing the pros and the cons of different substitute materials. So certainly the National Preservation Brief does not say absolutely not. It's always a consideration, but I think matching the visual and the historic integrity, matching physical properties is important to make sure that this generation of buildings really keeps that performance moving forward into the long term. So again, terracotta, we're going to see that more here at the end of the presentation, and I will show a little bit more, some examples of substitute materials on historic structures. And this again calls into kind of a very helpful, I believe it was updated in 2023, the preservation brief discussing substitute materials. So kind of a handy table here that highlights potential substitute materials. It's also worth noting that local jurisdictions may have more or less strict, usually more strict requirements depending upon the historic designation and whether your building is an individual landmark or in a historic district. So it's worth paying attention to whether or not your building is on the National Historic Register versus a state historic designated landmark when you're considering substitute materials. Preservation and repair of historic stucco is Another one that, again, reiterates the importance of mock-ups. Stucco, of course, is originally a sacrificial coating, a protective sacrificial coating. And so making sure that we allow sufficient time for material selection, material testing and material selection, stucco curing and proper installation, accounting for that expansion. Really understanding during the assessment phase why the stucco may be failing. Why is it cracking? Is it delaminating? Things of that nature. Um, are important when you're repairing those types of stucco properties, the stucco facades. And then cast iron, I won't get into it too much here, but you can see a section through a cast iron example facade on the right, retaining as much as possible of the original cast iron is typically the recommended preservation approach. Of course, then you have to begin considering things like soldering, welding. If you're proposing a substitute material, is it a risk of galvanic corrosion in marine and coastal environments? Again, always consider experienced contractors and craftsmen to do this work to avoid, damage to that cast iron. Because again, the more you damage, the more you'd have to consider repairing or replacing, which is strongly, strongly discouraged. And coating treatments, it does come into play with several of the other masonry materials that I mentioned. Usually in those other materials, the steel or the iron element is underneath, but with cast iron, obviously a coating system should be carefully selected and approved via mock-ups. What are the coating layers? What are the coating colors? As you can see here, the original condition was not great when we got on the facade. So the idea would be to prevent that type of deterioration from continuing, of course. And then cast stone, again, one of those other sort of more original or historic, if you will, substitute materials, has a few different names to it, but we do run into cast stone quite a bit in a lot of older, taller cities. Methods of repair for cast stone can be a little bit trickier, especially as you can see here, you have cement color and type matching. You also have aggregate color, size and finish matching. So this can be particularly tricky to do finish matching. You can kind of see the example on the right-hand side, but really relying on craftsmen for selection of each individual material that goes into the mix if you're going to be trying to match masonry materials. All right, so again, performance and durability is key here. Material compatibility is key. We will begin to talk about some of these case studies, but just wanted to reiterate, obviously, the importance of trying to repair first, trying to preserve that historic fabric first before addressing the areas that will inevitably require replacement for your project. Some case studies to give you a little bit of a sense of the type of structures that we encounter across the country. So this is a historic lighthouse. Actually, this lighthouse was moved from its original location in Georgia to Florida, and it stands today. It's encased in stucco, and the inside is multi-withe masonry walls. So again, and cast iron at the top, of course, holding that light. So these structures definitely result in multiple sets of mock-ups, multiple phases of work that need to be considered from the get-go when budgeting for a project. So just a snapshot of this project is the exterior stucco was addressed this year, and then future phases of the project will eventually address the interior granite stairs and the interior masonry wall. And now terracotta. Just a quick overview of, the history, some highlights of terracotta, if you will, in its use in architectural accents. So terracotta production started in the mid 1800s. Obviously, fireproofing was a big deal at the time. And then, of course, as we all know, terracotta became used extensively in New York and Chicago and many other cities as sort of a lighter, easier to fabricate, cheaper to source than natural stone. So Today, only two US based manufacturers remain. There is one based in the UK, supplying terracotta to projects across the country. Terracotta is fired clay, and its ceramic glaze is essentially what waterproofs the surface and mimics the appearance of natural stone. Different colors, even different textures can be achieved depending upon selections made during the fabrication process. One of the downsides of terracotta is that it has become known for deterioration, and resulted in facade ordinances that many of us know in many large cities. So lack of maintenance, failure to repoint or failure to address those corroding embedded steel elements and anchors has resulted in some pretty large, widespread, and well-known failures of these types of facades. So it's really important to understand how these structures were originally built and then the factors that influence how we repair them today. Often you see the majority of the deterioration, not all, but the majority focused on uh, the more exposed elements of the building, right? So cornices, horizontal projecting elements such as water tables, parapets, open balconies and terraces that collect water and essentially funnel them down through the mass masonry assemblies. This is where we see, I would say, the focused, the concentrated areas of deterioration. So the Ace Hotel was a structure that we assessed a couple years ago where, we were sounding areas of terracotta, looking for loose or damaged material as part of the facade ordinance. Beautiful building with a lot of very decorative elements. Some, unfortunately, that needed a little bit of tender loving care over here. Some cracks at the water table and at window head surrounds. So certainly we suspect that some corrosion is occurring within, but of course, with standing water on horizontal surfaces, it was clear to see that this building had been pinned actually quite a few times. So quite a hodgepodge and patch repairs too. So definitely some different things to address as we get into different types of historic structures. This is that first building we showed earlier, the Martinique, New York, was actually built in three sections. So different vintages of construction. That's the reason for the duration up there at the top, but different some different construction conditions that we're uncovering on this particular terracotta building that's actually under construction right now. So again, some beautiful decorative elements in terracotta that are in need of restoration and repair. Where we can, we obviously try to salvage as much of the original historic fabric as possible. Um, but plenty going on behind the scenes, as you can see here, with some corroded steel. Actually, on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see some of the original name from the Lackawanna steel on the right-hand side that has actually corroded all the way through. So getting a little bit creative with structural repairs is essential when you're dealing with some of these historic buildings, and understanding kind of how they were put together and how we're going to put them back together can be a pretty unique challenge as you're going through restoring these types of buildings. The Plaza Hotel, 1907. So this is a beautiful building that many are familiar with, thanks to Hollywood. On the bottom here, you can see the structure, the transitional steel frame structure, as it went up behind the brick, marble, and terracotta, of course, of the facades. So again, when we begin to dive into the type of deterioration occurring on these buildings, we start to look at projecting elements such as the water tables, the balustrades that are potentially holding water over many, many decades, and the corners where a lot of previous repairs have been performed. These are sort of our hot zones that we're looking out for when we're designing repairs to these buildings. And again, this terracotta has obviously seen several iterations of repair projects. And so just, I think, being aware of what work went on prior prior to your tenure on the building, and then coming into this with the knowledge that there are conditions to be addressed, and the levels of those conditions to be addressed is so important. Many of the projects that we work with, obviously, we use multiple methods to see what's going on. We've got aerial lifts, we've got drones, but very often, and I would say almost never, nothing beats, getting your hands on the building and getting your hands dirty. So, of course, we're always looking for ways to visit up close and get that access so that we can really see and touch what's going on with a particular building. And then, of course, top center, you can see construction going on. Also, it is ideal to make those probe openings when you can to really understand the extent of the deterioration you're dealing with. Just a high level view of our construction documents, process, and development for that type of a project. So it can be pretty tricky capturing all those conditions on one. The Waldorf Astoria, big project that went on for about 7 years back in the day. But again, a mismatch, excuse me, of plenty of types of materials. You've got limestone, cast stone, brick masonry, terracotta. And actually in the top center there, you've got a GFRC stone ornament that was used to replace a cast stone ornament that weighed over 800 pounds. So again, those substitute materials are not always the right choice, but when they are, it's especially important when you're considering, structural loads, weights that can be kind of addressed when you're thinking creatively about how to solve those structural problems on projects of this type. And then original drawings, on historic buildings, I guess, one of the biggest mysteries is where did the drawings go? And if you're lucky enough to find them, always your consultants will geek out over it. But, sometimes we don't have those drawings. So again, those probe openings are so, so important. The mock-ups and the probe openings can really tell us a lot about how a historic building assembly, came together, what was done, why is it deteriorating so significantly. It can really help us understand what's really going on under the surface. So, with a building on the National Register of Historic Places, or a building that you'd like to consider submitting for consideration as a historic building, what are the next steps? What really is that process to begin a project? Um, as far as a preservation project, we always start with document review. We're always researching the sites, the structures, the surrounding community, what is, perhaps an adjacent historic district, the architect, the design background of this particular structure, and why is it valuable to the community, and then putting all of that research and document review value into a report. Again, the material testing may vary. You may want dozens of tests if you have dozens of types of mortars or cladding materials. Very often the mortar and cladding material testing is required by, the local SHPO. So it is worth considering and planning for that test upfront as part of the condition assessment for your structure. And then the cost estimates, I'll touch on that in a little bit, but cost-based decisions, obviously everyone, building owners and managers, make critical decisions based on costs and phasing for a project. So just something to think about upfront is what types of efforts are you looking to complete in the different areas of your building? And again, that's something I'll touch on in a moment regarding phasing and cost estimating. Available drawings, report documentation, try to review them if they're available. Consider various cladding types, not thinking through perhaps different issues. Water infiltration especially can often come as an afterthought. So I think looking at the building holistically and understanding if there are contributing factors to the deterioration. So I mentioned here a few things that may complicate situations, but considering how the windows impact the historic facade next to it, if there is a skylight, if there is a roof, all of these adjacent systems interact with one another, and they have for, the 50 to 100 years that your historic structure has existed. So think of your building holistically. Think of creating investigative openings if you can during the assessment phase as much as possible to really understand the full scope and context of the project that you would need to plan for. And then again, that planning for the project, thinking about obviously safety is paramount. Budget, of course, is critical to anything that can be done at your building. Thinking through the impacts of the work on schedule, lead times and fabrication are not small values when you're considering replacing in kind for historic terracotta, among many other things. So selecting custom brick match and custom mortar match, these are things that can be expedited, if the design team is aware and, made aware of the types of testing they need to perform. It really is a team effort, I would say, during the planning and design phase. And I tend to view it as a collaborative process where you involve all the stakeholders and really just, organize your priorities, kind of as it alludes to here. Constructability and logistics, putting details on a page is great, but you definitely want to think through if anyone has opened the wall, has this repair been done in the past? Because that type of information, previous openings, is extremely valuable when you're doing this type of complex project on a historic structure. And then again, cost estimating, it varies by city, by region, by qualified contractors. It really helps to reach out to local qualified contractors experienced with this work. A square foot of brick repair and replacement is not the same thing as brick replacement and replacement of a parapet wall over top of structural steel. So really thinking through what the implications are when you open the wall is what will ultimately affect that pricing and how you budget for that project and how you phase that project. So understanding the tiers of priority, the most urgent repairs first, obviously anything that can fall and, harm, reach a street facing elevation is what I would suggest is the most critical, and as the facade ordinances dictate, the most critical, of course. So thinking through public safety, thinking through stabilization or temporary netting if you have to, that's all part and parcel to what you consider in your cost estimates. And then bidding out the project. Obviously, mock-ups and samples are essential, as we heard with those national preservation briefs. If your building is on the National Historic Register, and you're submitting for grant funding, there will be a detailed documentation process required for your mock-ups, your samples that you request. Those will likely all need to be submitted through the local regulatory agencies. So, that has an important impact on the schedule to complete this work. And then, of course, unforeseen conditions, that is also something that every project needs to manage and run into, or manage and plan to run into. And by that, I mean contingencies, allowances, ways that you can essentially discuss how you could mitigate unforeseen conditions. If you are aware that you have a transitional steel frame building, then that will, of course, dictate the types of the levels and percentages that you allocate for those before you actually bid the project, what you budget for. Phasing, as I mentioned, is very common. Phasing is typically to, of course, manage costs, but also logistics and disturbances to an occupied building. Operating businesses need to think about the impacts of this very noisy, very destructive work that needs to be completed, and often needs to be completed for structural reasons as well. So considering experience of the project team, not just the designer, but the construction teams, is critical to the time frame for completing these projects. Again, replacement of historic materials in kind. If you cannot salvage it, yes, it is recommended if you are an individually designated landmark. However, if you're not an individual landmark, it is optional. It's worth considering, though, that matching existing properties is one of the most critical pieces to long-term performance. And typically substitute materials can have an impact on how adjacent materials perform. So it's really important if you are considering substitute materials, do your research, discuss with your experts, with your design professionals, just to understand the long-term repercussions of those types of selections. It's not to say it's not allowed. We're certainly not saying that, but proceed with caution, I think is the best approach. How long will permitting take? This is a very open-ended question depending on the jurisdiction that you're talking to, and again, city, state, and federal hurdles, but it can take multiple months. So really giving that time to your design team to plan for this project is critical. Again, same thing for construction. Construction can vary, but a year or more can be eaten up simply in the mock-up and the readiness, the fabrication process. So planning ahead for those projects can be especially valuable. And then community involvement, you obviously have plenty of stakeholders with your historic structures. Plenty of people will see the work being done, plenty of questions may arise. So just planning ahead for understanding the challenges of these unique projects. Special access may be required. We didn't even really touch on that, but there's so much value in really just sitting down with the various parties on the project, design and construction team both, to understand different ways to overcome these challenges. And then as we kind of wrap up here, your industry resources, of course, architects and structural engineers experienced with historic structures are important and critical to the success of your project. But there are many local expert groups. The Association of Preservation Technology is one that you can reach out to, as well as IMI, the International Masonry Institute. So there are plenty of resources out there relevant to historic buildings. I pointed out one here. They have some very, very useful isometric details on historic terracotta assemblies and other historic assemblies. So plenty of resources out there when you're looking to complete these projects or simply have a question on how to build it. And that's it.
Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. And we have a few questions in the Q&A. And if you have any questions, please feel free to continue to type them, and we'll get the Q&A session started here. Our first question is, the National Park Service issued the first preservation brief in 1978 on energy efficiency, and there are now over 50. Are they kept up to date?
Yes. So the answer to that is yes. And actually, I think I referenced it. I can't remember if I put it on the slide, so I apologize. But several of them have been updated, and several, I believe they even remove them if it is believed that, they're less relevant to the practice today, the practice of restoration. But I don't believe they actively update them with the exception of if there are, certain technologies that makes that relevant. In other words, the substitute materials preservation brief that I highlighted was last updated in 2023. Again, if the reality is that the intent of the guidance stays the same, I don't believe any updates are issued. So, that might be a good question for the National Park Service directly.
Okay, thank you. Next question. So you commented on there are only two companies that are sourcing terracotta replacement materials. The question is the supply of alternative materials keeping up with the demand?
That's a tricky question, I think, to handle. Architectural terracotta is a unique one because the two fabricators, without giving too much credit to either the fabricators of terracotta, who I've worked with both of them in the United States and the one in the United Kingdom, as well as those who fabricate substitute materials, um, the materials are available. I think it's really a question of planning for the projects and the qualifications of those companies that produce the materials. So, really working closely with those fabricators or substitute material fabricators, I think is the key to delivering a successful project. I know that doesn't answer your question. I don't really know if there's a true yes versus no supply demand answer. Um, but I guess just speaking from the standpoint of someone who works in New York City, where a lot of these projects are completed, so far the supply is adequate. It's really more about the planning. So again, sorry if that doesn't quite answer your question.
Hey, thank you. Next question. Have you ever done your probe openings and simply say this is beyond repair, or does it just take enough money?
This is beyond repair. Oh, absolutely. I think I showed a few photos there back in the presentation. I guess it's distracting if I go back in the slideshow. But yes, I mean there is steel sometimes that is simply, it's rust paging. It's the paging of a book. It's disintegrated in your hand and it's essentially gone. There's no structure. So yes, the whole parapet wall or the whole section of stone or the whole section of terracotta does have to be replaced. So again, the point of the presentation wasn't to say absolutely not, no replacement ever. The point of it was really to stress, repair if possible, repair if feasible, repair if, your qualified team and your structural engineer agree that it is feasible to repair. Sometimes it's just not possible. It has gone too far. It's beyond. And in that case, you're looking to restore to the original condition, usually to match, adjacent or whatever the condition was. But yeah, I think that does happen quite frequently to many of us.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What are the current guidance on replacement windows? Are aluminum-clad wood windows allowed?
That question, that's one of those it depends questions. It really will depend if you are a designated individual landmark. Are you in a historic district? What is historic about the windows? One of the other questions to ask, especially if you are a designated landmark, were those windows original? As we know, there are many changes of use in a structure. You might have a ground level retail tenant that has been changing throughout the decades, whereas the upper floors were never touched. So, yes, I have seen aluminum clad wood windows be approved in certain jurisdictions, but it's really going to depend on what building it is, what window you're trying to replace and why. Again, the idea would be to try to repair in situ if possible, or excuse me, repair the windows if possible. But if you're looking at a replacement window, again, that's really going to be an iterative process with your design team to understand what your landmarks preservation commission, sorry, that's the New York one, what the landmarks organization will permit for your specific structure.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. And next question. When testing products or replacement materials, how long is long enough for a test? For example, it seems like a mortar mix has to take longer than testing a cleaning method.
So this, I think, gets to a little bit of the distinction between a mock-up and a mortar mix. So, um, testing existing mortar, the tests I alluded to, so I apologize if I went a little bit too quickly. Testing mortar is what I'm referring to as petrographic testing of your mortar, which will tell you the components, whether there is a Portland cement or a lime mortar in your mortar. So that type of petrographic testing is more taking samples of mortar, sending them to an authorized testing lab, and receiving a report back. So that takes, a couple weeks from qualified labs, and there are several across the country that are very qualified to do that type of petrographic analysis. Cleaning, what I was speaking to, at least for the specific purpose of that slide, was cleaning mock-ups. So cleaning mock-ups can also easily take days, weeks. Certain cleaning methods can take minutes per pass, right? So there might be a 5 minute dwell time for a chemical, laser cleaning, again, steam cleaning. these different methodologies of cleaning are going to take different amounts of time when you're doing them in the field. So that's a little bit different. And then mortar mixing, by the way, plenty of the manufacturers of historically matched mortars, and again, I won't name them here to be unbiased, but they have the capacity to assist with testing. They can also provide historic mortar matches to match the materials on your facade. So I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Has your company been working on many mid-century buildings? Are you finding that replacement materials still very difficult to source?
Um, I have not found replacement materials terribly difficult to source. I think it depends on the market you're in. It depends on the quantity, especially, if you're looking for a low quantity of any material, that has been very tricky. I was looking to source a very specific aggregate when I was on the West Coast for a project, and that took some time. So it really depends on the type of material you're referring to. Like I said, plenty of the mortar manufacturers, historic mortar manufacturers, are familiar with the types of testing and matching they have to perform. So I would say, the sooner the better to engage your design team, your testing agency. The sooner you can get those samples to a lab to match, the less your fabrication timelines will impact your schedule. But I'm not sure what you were referring to as far as specific mid-century materials, so I apologize if I didn't touch on it.
Hey, thank you. Next question. Did you have any involvement in the restoration of the Detroit train station in Michigan?
I did not. I don't believe our firm was involved in that project, but I'd have to check with Dave. Our Detroit office did work on several projects recently, and I apologize. I'm not sure why those slides didn't make it into this presentation. Walker has worked on Book Tower and Harvard Square properties in Detroit recently, but we, to my knowledge, did not work on the Detroit train station.
Okay, thank you. Um, Next question is, which historic materials are proven to be the most likely to deteriorate?
Well, as I mentioned, unfortunately, falling terracotta. Terracotta gets a bad rap because of its, catastrophic failures, I would say. Brick does as well. I think we've all seen some of the news stories in larger major cities with, masonry failing due to lack of lateral ties and things of that nature. But honestly, I would actually just backtrack on myself and just say the structural steel. At the end of the day, the terracotta itself is a great material. It performs very well in compression, and if properly detailed, properly designed, these buildings, these facades have lasted over 100 years, 120, 140 years in some cases. It's really that underlying steel and long-term freeze thaw, right? The water that gets to the steel that rusts the steel. It's really that water that has been detrimental to these facades over the years. So, I would kind of hedge my bets and blame the rusted steel as a structural engineer by background. I hope that's fair.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is it ever appropriate to replace damaged cast iron with natural stone?
Oh, cast stone, it says.
Oh, cast stone, I'm sorry.
Um, yeah, no, it's okay. Well, cast stone is a lot more like a modern precast. So when we say cast stone, it's really like a historic precast, if you will. Is it appropriate? I would say, again, this goes to whether or not your building is a designated landmark. Are you applying for designation? Replacement materials, you're supposed to match in kind so that the deterioration, that the weathering, that the performance of the material, even differential movement wise, doesn't change the facade. Natural stone, if it was selected to match with the cast stone, I wouldn't necessarily see a problem there. But again, natural stone can be more porous. Are you using a limestone? What kind of natural stone are you using? Obviously a granite is selected for ground level, entrances and things like that because it is so durable. So I would say that's another one where I'd have to say it depends. Cast stone, and I had a few photos of it. related to the Waldorf, that can deteriorate, especially when it's used on those edges, corners, parapets. Um, so it's really tough to say without that mock-up.
Thank you. Next question. Do you find a shortage of qualified terracotta and stone restoration tradesmen? And what is being done to train the next generation?
I'm aware of the shortage. I'm a longtime member of SWRI, the Sealant Waterproofing and Restoration Institute. So I've definitely been in conversations where there is a shortage of tradespeople to complete these projects. Fortunately, I think the industry is trying to do a better job of, making known that these are great careers. In New York City, especially New York City, Chicago, Detroit. Boston, plenty of these markets have kind of the union and non-union side of things. So without getting too into the nitty-gritty, I think that people are trying to engage the trades and really build up the knowledge of what it is to do this work, to build masonry walls, to properly repoint. So they're very complex projects, but there is definitely a shortage.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple more questions. Okay, next question. What do you think of the replacement building materials that are plastic or other completely man-made materials? They said they have recently saw a beautiful detailed replacement cornice line or on a small commercial building that was plastic.
I'm not sure about the plastic ones. I have seen fiberglass used on several buildings actually. I don't know if I have it in a photo, but they actually you can kind of see it here. There's some fiberglass ornaments that were recreated on the facade of the plaza. But I don't the well, the interesting thing about this question is it's twofold, right? Because terracotta is also man-made, right? Cast stone is also man-made. So technically speaking, I don't believe that the letter of the preservation briefs, dictates only naturally occurring materials are to be used on buildings, right? Steel has to hold up the buildings, of course, right? Or in some cases doesn't if it's a fully load-bearing mass masonry structure. But I think it really again, back to kind of the intent of this is to maintain that historic fabric as much as possible, really consider the performance, how it will perform long term. If it's for a structural purpose, if it's serving a structural purpose, I'm kind of circling this GFRC, just thinking to myself here, when it's something that is so heavy that can long term impact in a negative way the structure, then consideration of an alternate material is typically accepted. It really depends on if it's an individually designated landmark, if it's in a field of multiple units, is it going to stand out? Is it going to weather differently, move differently, etc. So there's plenty of factors to consider, not just, well, it's a substitute material, should I use it? It's a substitute material, but I will use it in a way that practically speaking makes sense. It is constructible. It benefits the project long term. I think the one of the main questions to really ask is, talk to those professionals and understand what the potential ramifications are on your building and where those materials might be used.
Okay, thank you. Then we have one last question. When presenting a project to a local historic district commission, are you finding the commissioners aware of the newest products and materials?
Yes, most of them are very aware. Manufacturers tend to be out there talking about the benefits of their products. So I think it's just important to keep in mind that most of that literature is out there and made public for both the specifiers and for the commissioners of I guess it depends on the district, right? If you're thinking of a specific district that I'm not aware of, I'm not sure if that particular one is aware, but in general, I would say in the larger municipalities, they are very aware of those products.
Okay. Okay, I think that's all our questions. And thank you, Sarah, so much for your knowledge and time. putting together this preservation presentation for us. And thank you everybody for participating. And there will be a survey when this close up, and so please participate in the survey to help us improve our webinar. Before I let everybody go, I will quickly announce that our next webinar is scheduled for April 30th at 1 o'clock as Beacon of Hope. And I will send everybody the details in the email and hope to see you all next time. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.